Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Goober Philosophy. I am your host, the Goober Philosopher, and today I'm going to change hats a bit and get into some topics that aren't necessarily about philosophy, but it's some deep shit, and we're gonna talk about it. We're gonna get into relationships, and are you in a toxic relationship or not, or just looking at relationship paradigms that work. So, full disclosure, I'm a married man, going on to 2 years at this point, and I think I know a thing or two about relationships at this point. I didn't always know what that stuff was, but I've read books and I have gotten real life data, so to speak, in my own relationships. And I also have friends that I've observed, and it's more data that I've thought about. And I've come up with some conclusions based on my observations. So I think that it's good for, let's just talk about men here. It's good for men to get into relationships in terms of their growth and maturity. You need to expose yourself to other people's lives to kind of figure out where you fit in, the adult world or society, I guess you could call it. However, not every relationship is built to last, but some are. And I want to look at what those differences are. Like, what makes a relationship that's going to stretch on for decades and what's going to be done in 10 minutes, right? Like, what are some signs, I guess, some red flags that things are going bad, and what are some signs that maybe you have what it takes to get married and pursue a family and so forth. So just kind of thinking about where I want to go with this, and maybe I'll start with the positive today, and then we can talk about the negative. So positive signs that you're in a relationship that works, that's going to last. There might be more than this. I haven't thought extensively about all the archetypes of relationships, but there's 3 that I came up with that to me indicate that you're going to last. So here's the 3 archetypes that I've come up with. Like I said, there's probably more, but here we go. So to me, one paradigm, one archetype, one type of dynamic that seems to me acceptable in terms of long-term marriages and relationships is what I have called the kite and rock relationship. So I don't think I'm the one who came up with this, but I see how it works. So basically, in a relationship, you have someone who is a little more emotional, and then someone who's a little more stable. So the kite in this example is the one that's a little more emotional, and it's the person that who's going to push the limits. Kites are designed to go pretty high up in the air. They kind of fly away from the surface, where the rock is what anchors the kite as it reaches closer to the sun. It kind of reminds me of the example in Greek mythology. I think it was Icarus built like wings, and then Icarus flew too close to the sun, and the wings burned up, and he fell back down to earth. Like, that's a metaphor that I'm using here in the same sense, where you don't want to fly too high up in the air. You don't want to get too high on yourself. You don't want to get too excitable, too emotional, too I don't know, just over the top, out of pocket, whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, it's when you push the limits that you get better results. So the kite and the rock dynamic here is really a metaphor for saying you have someone who is a go-getter and you have someone who is good with just staying put, right? And this dynamic, I think, works because it's kind of like the adage opposites attract. Like, you don't necessarily want two people in a relationship that are superstars. I don't think those relationships last. And we're gonna get into like what relationships don't work, but I guess we'll take a little detour and get into that right now. It's like great examples, Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, right? So, they lasted for years. I mean, when I was a kid, they were in a marriage forever. However, it doesn't last. And what tends to be the case with Hollywood relationships, when it's two stars, they don't last. I don't think in a relationship you can have two kites. In this example, Brad and Angelina are both well within their industry considered superstars. They're pushing the limits of their careers and they're doing a great job, but you need someone in that dynamic to be like supporting the person while they're pushing the limits, because if both of them feel like, hey, why isn't my partner like supporting me right now? Why are they so worried about their career? I feel like that lack of support, it doesn't last forever. You can't have two kites. You go off into the sun. So I hopefully this is making sense here, but the rock and the kite dynamic I think works. If you have one person that's stable and one person that's, stable but pushing the limits, that's going to work. I think another dynamic that can work in a marriage is what I've called best friends. So I've seen relationships where the partners are, they're married and they perform the natural obligations, but they're also best friends. And it's a beautiful thing when you see two people who honestly wouldn't want to spend any other time with anyone else. And it works. It definitely works. So you can be best friends with your partner. You don't necessarily have to be best friends with your partner for your relationship to last forever, or as long as you guys live together. It's not necessarily what's going to happen. I mean, you're not necessarily going to have a relationship where everyone is looking at you two and saying like, "Oh my God, look at these guys. They're really good together. They work really strongly together because they're best friends." I mean, that ideally you have that. I think that's probably ideal for a relationship to be best friends with your partner. I think it's a newer trend too. I don't think like marriages that were old school necessarily had two people that were best friends. I mean, even today, there's still there's arranged marriages where people like get married, don't know the person for more than like a week, and then they spend the rest of their lives together. I guess in that example, over time, you could develop a relationship where you're best friends. It would still take time, but I think if you're living in the best friends model of relationships, you ease your way into where you are today, and then eventually it blossoms into a marriage. It's probably the longest form of building a relationship to figure, because in my opinion, to become a best friend with someone takes time. I mean, you can become a partner overnight. You just, you do what you got to do. But the best friend dynamic is probably the most time consuming and probably the most stable dynamic for a relationship if you can get there. It isn't necessary, like I said, because then I've come up with like the more old school approach, which to me, it's a dynamic I've coined the giver and provider, which is to me what you see when a man goes to work, and the woman stays home and she provides for the children. The man comes home and gives his income to the family. They might not necessarily get along all the time, the spouses do, but this is really what marriages started out as. It's like you're the provider, or I might mess this up, but basically the man provides, the woman gives to the family, right? She gives life into the family by birthing children. She gives sustenance by making food. And some people might say this is a very antiquated maybe even misogynistic approach, but this is the way marriages worked for probably thousands of years. Not that I've done the research, but the giver and provider paradigm is like old school marriages basically, and they work. I mean, they do, because really, like I said, you don't have to be best friends with your partner, but you do have to be able to provide as a man. That is like, I don't know if that's number one, but it's probably number one important thing in the marriage is that you as a man are providing some kind of resource that the woman needs, especially when they're pregnant, because when women get pregnant, they really have to rely on the man to provide. So those are the three paradigms that work. I want to get to the paradigms that to me are red flags in relationships that you should be worried about if you see them in your relationship. Ideally, you get to the paradigms that I initially said, which are, I'll repeat the last three I said: the kite and the rock, best friends, and giver and provider. Those are the three, I guess, dynamics that work that I've noticed in relationships. Now, for the dynamics or paradigms or archetypes that don't work, the first one I'll go into, because I've seen this a lot in like younger couples, is the lovebirds. And we all like to show passion. We all like this. We post pictures with our boo, and it's great. I'm all for it. I think you should show passion, especially when you're early on in your relationship. But here's the thing in my observation. I've noticed that the lovebirds dynamic, where they can't stop touching each other in public, it's not sustainable, and here's why. Because passion is great, but passion doesn't last forever. And if you're just riding on just raw attraction for your partner, more power to you, but you have to eventually shift into those other three examples I just said that work. If you're like showing PDA, public displays of affection all the time, you might be putting a Band-Aid on a bigger issue. Maybe you just don't know what to say to this person because you don't really love them, unfortunately. Maybe lovebirds do what they do because they're trying to rationalize, like, why am I with this person? Oh, well, I am attracted to him, so this is why I'm with them. And they continue to show the world that, yeah, we love each other. And they post things online so everyone can validate that, yeah, you're great for each other. But why do you need that outside validation? That's, I guess, where I see it doesn't last. It's because a relationship, there should only be two people that matter, you and your spouse. So if you're doing the lovebirds approach, that's fine early on, but it might be a red flag. You might be compensating for something else. So I would just say if you're very passionate about your partner, that's great. But also try to develop like a relationship with your partner and try to become best friends. Or I don't know. I don't think lovebirds are going to be like the giver and provider approach. I think it's too passionate to just go from that to like a very traditional route. So I would say probably best friends or kite and rock is probably where you're going to land if you're going to last forever. But you can't be lovebirds forever. You have to eventually get more mature. Moving on to another, I would say, toxic paradigm, dynamic, whatever, that doesn't work in a relationship is victim and aggressor. This is pretty obvious. This is probably the worst case scenario for relationships. You tend to have a damsel in distress and Superman's actually like Lex Luthor or something. Like, you don't want that. I don't know if I have to get into a lot of examples, but a lot of alcoholics tend to have this dynamic in their relationship. When drugs are involved, things get pretty bad. Sometimes the aggressor becomes the victim. Sometimes the aggressor victimizes their partner. So that's obviously a negative dynamic you don't want to get into in your relationship. Another one I've decided on that it's a very toxic as well is called victim and victim. Basically, both people raise their hand and say, I'm victimized. Both people don't want to step up. Both people think the other person just doesn't want to listen to them. And yeah, that's gonna be a no for me, dog. If you're constantly bickering with your partner about who's more victimized, yeah, you got to take a hike. That's a wrap on that one. Another negative archetype is the taker and provider. This is kind of like a spin-off of like what I would call the giver and provider. So the taker and provider dynamic is basically the man provides, but the woman just keeps taking. She doesn't provide for the children. She doesn't cook. She doesn't clean. She doesn't do jack shit. She just keeps taking and taking and taking. Or it could be the other way around. Maybe the woman provides and the man keeps taking and taking and taking, and he doesn't do his chores. He doesn't do shit. Toxic, not going to last. And then the last one I've come up with, because I don't want to go too much further into all this shit. The last one is employee and boss. Basically, you see it more where the woman thinks she's the boss of her husband. The husband just, thinks he's the employee, and she gets to boss him around. Now, it's not necessarily this way. You can also have a husband that thinks he's the boss of his wife, and she's just, doing whatever he says. Once again, not going to last. Maybe it'll last, but it's fucking hell. So I think of all the toxic examples I gave, the worst one is definitely victim and aggressor. That's certainly not going to last. Lovebirds could last. Victim and victim, I don't think would last either. Taker and provider, I guess as long as you're okay with being taken advantage of, it could last. And then employee and boss, it'll last. It's just hell. So this is what I wanted to talk about here, and I'll end with this. So relationships are defined by day-to-day interactions, like I've listed above. They're also defined by the goals and outcomes that you and your partner decide you want to achieve as a couple. Goals are defined by the values you share. If your goals aren't lining up or the outcomes are not good based on your goals for you and your partner that you set, then this becomes a source of friction in the relationship. The more friction in the relationship, the more likely the bond between you and your partner, it will eventually break. So this is all to say, if you have a dynamic in your relationship that's not causing friction, good. This is good stuff. If you and your partner have a dynamic that causes a lot of friction, it's probably not going to last. So I'll leave you with this. Are you in a toxic relationship? I don't know. Maybe you want to look at these dynamics and see where you fit. Anyways, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening, and have a good day. Goodbye.